Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The show must go on, as they say. It's certainly a well-worn saying that's a part of the modern day lexicon, and I've heard it being mentioned a lot in stories and interviews since Anthony Joshua's original opponent for October 28th, Kubrat Pulev, pulled out of the fight through injury. We now know, of course, he's been replaced by Carlos Takam, who is very much a live body. Someone who has decent power and perhaps just enough skill to potentially trouble Joshua. I really like this fight for the simple reason I think it's a more dangerous proposition than the Pulev fight, just because of the power factor. And I've been mulling over this whole situation in the past day or so, and I've been thinking, should they just have postponed the event? Pulev was out. It wouldn't have been unreasonable to do so in the circumstances. Certainly we see other fights cancelled because, a fighter has pulled out through injury. And I'm sure they've got all sorts of insurance and whatnot for these sorts of situations and circumstances. So I'm going to run through a few of the things that I think are worth considering. And these are the sort of risk factors, from taking on this fight at short notice. Because I think they're worth going through. And I'll also give my view on why I think Eddie Hearn has pushed ahead. And I really do think it's a situation where it boils down to one or two things. You probably guess what one of them is. So in some ways though, I think cancelling the event would have been in Anthony Joshua's best interest. He's been training for the past couple of months for Kubrat Pulev. No doubt watching countless hours of film to identify his weaknesses and tendencies, countless hours in the gym working on a fight plan and sharpening his skills, and all the sort of other associated stuff that goes with it. The simple fact is, Carlos Takam is a different fighter, with a vastly different style. Joshua hasn't been training for him, and that in itself is a risk. How big a risk? Well, that's the sort of unknown factor, but we're introducing another risk here. More risk. And Eddie Hearn mentioned that they'd lined Takam up as the backup some time ago. So while maybe Joshua was aware of it, or could have been doing some things just in case this happened, but it still doesn't change the fact that it's a vastly different scenario to train for weeks and weeks on end and expecting a certain fighter, and now you're going to be fighting another guy. Mentally, he put all his focus into fighting Pulev, and that's where it should be, or should have been. Now he has to refocus and also retrain at short notice for this new opponent. I mean, arguably, Takam is the second best opponent Joshua has faced after Klitschko. I mean, some would say maybe Dillian Whyte is better, but I think this version of Carlos Takam is better than the earlier version of Whyte. If Whyte and Takam fought now, I mean, that would, that's a different story. But I think the Whyte from 2 years ago, Takam now would beat that version of Whyte. He's no joke. He is a live body, as I say. So not only does Anthony Joshua have to refocus mentally on this new opponent, and adjust his training, he's actually never been through this situation before. At least not at this level. There's a lot on the line here. And experience should never be underestimated. Once you've been through a certain situation, you know how to deal with it the next time. That's why there's the saying, the benefit of experience. Because it is a benefit. As we know, Joshua doesn't have an extensive pro career. He didn't have an extensive amateur career. He's learning on the job, and he's only 19 fights into his pro career. And a decent chunk of those 19 guys were overmatched fighters. Some would call some of them bums. But that's what happens when you, come up. You work your way through the levels. And he's got a certain type of experience from those fights, and also his step-up fights, like Whyte, Martin, Brazil, and obviously Klitschko. And I'm sure we'll say, well, he learned a lot about himself in the Vlad fight. And that's undeniable. But is it really the same as swapping high-level opponents under 2 weeks out from the fight night? I'm not so sure it is. And professional sports is littered with examples of late replacements coming in and getting the win, or doing very well. It does happen. I'm not saying that Takam will win, but I wouldn't be shocked either. I think most people would agree that Joshua's chances of beating Takam would rise dramatically if he had a full training camp. The reality now is he's got 10 days to prepare for him. And some will say it's the same for Takam, that he's in the same boat. But I'm not so sure about that. I mean, for me, he's not. He knew that he could be drafted in at short notice. He knew this could happen. Eddie Hearn lined him up. He's been specifically training for Anthony Joshua for weeks. That is an advantage. Surely. And he's no doubt got nothing to lose mentally. It's all upside for Carlos Takam. Not many are expecting him to win. Whereas the overwhelming majority of people are expecting Joshua to win. And not just win, but crush Takam. That is a burden for anyone to carry. And especially a relatively inexperienced champion. And let's face it, it's heavyweight boxing. Takam has a chance just because it's heavyweight boxing. And no matter how slim that chance is, it still exists. So, can he upset Anthony Joshua? Well, he has a chance. I'm not saying that he will, but I wouldn't be shocked either. I mean, look at some of these circumstances I've just outlined. So why did the fight go ahead? Well, I think it really comes down to, it's a matter of simple economics. There was just too much money on the line. You think everything that would be involved with this event of this size, the stadium hire, the tickets have already been sold. And a lot of them, 80,000 tickets? All the myriad of associated logistics with the fight that are either done or in action now. And let's not forget the pay-per-view sales. I know that there's some people who are bitterly disappointed with this late change. But let's face it, Joshua could face an Uber driver. They could just pull someone off the street and he would still make a boatload of money. He literally is the golden goose. And then you chuck in endorsement deals, advertising, TV appearances, merchandise. I'm sure merchandise is huge. Then there's the other fighters who are on that card, who are depending on purses. You've got the people who'd be working on the night, like security, catering, hospitality for VIPs. And then you've got, in Cardiff as well, there's all the associated things that go on with an event this size. It really is a massive undertaking and a massive economic injection for Cardiff, but also for Matchroom and for Anthony Joshua. It is too big to fail. Eddie Hearn will not let it fail. Come hell or high water, he was always going to push ahead with this. So it's no surprise that Hearn had teed up Takam as the replacement some time ago. He literally had Takam as the insurance policy of sorts if anything happened to Pulev. But then you think of what I've just mentioned a little earlier about some of the risks that are introduced with a late replacement fighter, and especially one that's no stiff. This is not Eric Molina. And you think about, well, where did Anthony Joshua come into it in terms of his welfare, his career? Who's looking out for him on that front? It would appear that side of things is secondary in this equation. He's the hot commodity that needs to be sold and marketed to the masses. Hearn has to eke out every last cent out of him while he can, while he's in his prime and while he's at peak Joshua. And that's what it is. It's peak Joshua. He is a sensation that is just generating. It's like having a money printing machine. That's what it's like at the moment. Kind of like it was with Mike Tyson in the 80s, early 90s. He was just so massive back then. He was getting the paydays when, like, was it $25 million in 1989 or whatever it was, 1990? I mean, that was ridiculous then. It still sounds ridiculous now. But just think, what if the unthinkable happened and Takam scores a massive upset? I'm sure the short-term gain for holding this event on October the 28th, it's going to appear incredibly short-sighted, and especially given the long-term gain they'd be giving up as a result of a loss. Now, I do think it would be a completely different story and a completely different risk versus reward equation if you drafted in someone like an Eric Molina. But Takam, he is an experienced professional with some gas still in the tank. Sure, he's the massive underdog, but just imagine how people would treat Eddie Hearn if the unthinkable happened. The air would go out of the balloon pretty fast. Not just for Hearn, but for Joshua in general. It would dent his marketability hugely. People would be launching in. I mean, some people are ready to launch in already. I mean, I know there's a lot of people who want to say that Anthony Joshua is Frank Bruno II. Someone who is good, but maybe not quite as good as people thought he would be. And a lot of people are already willing to go after Eddie Hearn, who they think puts the mighty dollar first and fighters second. So for me, this is this decision because he'd sewed up Takam in advance. It's a bit of a balancing act. It'd be a different story if Joshua had a full, 12-week training camp under his belt for Takam specifically. But 10 days, that's introducing risk. And like I've said in my previous video, I do favour AJ to win, probably in rounds 6 to 8. But, I could see Takam being a much more difficult opponent than many will expect. And any time that you do introduce more risk into the equation than otherwise would be the case, it's, anything can happen. So I guess we don't have long to find out now, so we'll have to see how it all plays out. But if there was a massive upset, I wouldn't be completely shocked. I would be a bit shocked, of course. But you can never rule it out. It's heavyweight boxing. But I just, had been thinking about this in terms of should they have just, put this off, put this back? But clearly, the show must go on. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.